why for you was reality so central to the story that you wanted to tell about, the deep state in America and how it determines the truths and untruths fed to us?
Thank you for asking that. I think this book is born of an anxiety that many of us feel right now, which is that we've lost control of our identities, and that there are pieces of us on email and in the cloud and in Facebook messages and texts, and that those pieces of us can kind of be ripped apart and consolidated into a person we don't recognize. It's more than taking something out of context. It's building a different narrative. And a very extreme case of this is the case of Reality Winner, who is a young whistleblower who was portrayed using just those methods through texts, chats with her sister, jail calls, in a completely ridiculous way as a deep state terrorist. And this was the prosecution's story. It was a story that the judge was very sympathetic to, and took this pretty, essentially harmless 25-year-old and portrayed her as such a danger to society that she wasn't even let out on bail during her trial under the Espionage Act. And so, obviously that's an extreme case, but there's a sense that we have lost agency that I think is common among all of us.
I mean, how did they build that narrative about her? I guess it would be useful for you to remind people a bit about her story, how she got into the position that she was in versus the insane, narrative built by the government to lock her up under the Espionage Act, which is obviously in the news right now for Trump.
So newly relevant because a very different defendant has been charged under the Espionage Act.
Right.
So yeah, Reality was a 25-year-old who was working as a contractor at the NSA. And, she was going through kind of a quarter-life crisis. There was a lot happening for her. And she came upon a document that she didn't really need to be reading, which wasn't related to her work. A single document that suggested to her that Russia had been involved in attempts to overturn the 2016 election. It was just this account of the simple phishing attack on a voting system in Florida. And so she thought to herself, why doesn't everyone know this? I mean, this was a time when this was a very live question. If you turn on the radio, you turn on cable news, people were arguing, oh, well, there's no evidence. Well, she felt that she had evidence and she wanted to see how it would play out. So she printed it out. She stuck it in her pantyhose. She walked out of the NSA. And she sent it to the Intercept, which mishandled the document, and she ended up in jail for 4 years.
Right. And can you talk a bit about the Intercept's handling of this? Because I think, maybe there's some hesitancy to go after the Intercept on the left because of how much great work they do and how many great reporters they have there. We have them on the show regularly, but you don't pull punches about the way that the Intercept handled this information. And to be honest, obviously, it was a massive, massive mistake, and she bore the brunt of it by going to jail.
Yeah, I share with you your admiration for so much of what the Intercept has done. They've really filled a hole in what, there ought to be an adversarial journalistic process. And that just didn't exist with regard to the national security state until the Intercept appeared. In this case, it was just a complete absence, it seems, of protocol. So they received, in a mailbox, a PO box, this document that seemed to have come from nowhere. And that wasn't how reporters at the Intercept say that they were used to dealing with documents. There was this whole very complicated protocol for dealing with the Snowden documents at the Intercept. And it was actually so complex and onerous that people complained about it. They said, is this theater? Because this is so annoying. We have to go into this little room to report on these documents. There's cameras everywhere. We have to log everything. This is so annoying that lots of good potential work isn't getting done. But for some reason, this document that Reality had sent never entered that stream of action. It was just handed to a reporter who, again, for some unknown reason, did not go over, like literally across the room to where sat some of the best digital security experts in media. I mean, they were just never consulted. And I mean, the document was mishandled in many different ways. I think someone who knew more about digital security wouldn't have just posted it online,
Right.
where the document contained various identifying marks. Certainly someone involved who knew about digital security would not have sent, a text containing an image of the document to whoever does public relations at or whoever that was a spokesperson for the NSA. And kind of all of these missteps added up. I think the Intercept would say, oh, she would have ended up in jail anyway. But there's no question that this process is not one anyone would defend at this point.
Right. I mean, so essentially there was like a digital footprint that was not revealed, or not removed, I should say, that revealed that Reality, like they were able to trace her to the leak of the information.
Yeah. And, there's really no way at this point for a government employee to print out a classified document and not have it traced, because everything is being logged, right? So I think what somebody would have, what people are doing more often now is just taking a document and instead of posting it, maybe summarizing it, right? Like there are ways to, there are more sophisticated ways to deal with leaked information than just slapping something online.
Right. Yeah. And that, so, I mean, how then, after this, information was given to the Intercept and it was published, and then clearly the government was able, then I guess this was 2017, now Trump's in office. This had to do with Russian interference in the election. Obviously, he's, called that a hoax hundreds and hundreds of times. And it is incredibly ironic, by the way, that he's currently being prosecuted under the Espionage Act, the same act his government used against Reality Winner, Daniel Hale, other whistleblowers in this way. But how then did they build this case against her? What was the government's portrayal of Reality Winner versus the no pun intended, the reality of who she is?
So Reality is a millennial. She's really funny. She's really sarcastic. A lot of her communication was with her sister, with whom she had this particular banter. And so, they were having a conversation, I think, about climate change. And Reality texts her sister, well, I only say I hate America 3 times a day, LOL. And
that's good.
In the courtroom, right, you a prosecutor saying, oh, she says she hates America 3 times a day. And suddenly this completely tossed off comment becomes, this profoundly ominous desire to destroy us all, right?
Yeah.
And that kept happening. Little things like, well, why does she have so many laptops? How many old laptops do you have in your house, right? Like, that she had used BitTorrent, like that she had been on different websites, that she had been trained. She's an NSA linguist, so she'd been trained in Dari and Pashto, languages used in certain areas of Pakistan. She knew Farsi. And so she was interested in using those languages, not just to eavesdrop on people, which is what she'd been trained for, but to communicate. And so she was interested in those regions. And her interest in those regions was then taken as ominous, a sign of something unusual. She had become, after 9/11, she'd become very interested in language because her father had told her that if we could communicate better, then maybe 9/11 could have been prevented. And so she started learning Arabic at like the age of 9. And the prosecutor portrayed this as very strange. Also, she wasn't allowed to talk about her work because it was classified. And so her parents gave this very moving, convincing testimony about all her volunteer work. She's like a deeply good, civic-minded, involved person. And then the prosecutor would say, well, you can't really know her, can you? Because she can't tell you about her work. So essentially, like, the nature of the person the government had made Reality Winner was used against her.
It really is like much like the prosecution of all of these whistleblowers, right? Like Chelsea Manning is one of the gravest like injustices on this front in the 21st century. The like you don't just highlight Reality Winner, although of course she's so central to the story. You talk about other whistleblowers, even some less talked about, like John Kiriakou. I hope I'm
Yeah,
pronouncing that
yeah. And
right.
I would also mention Daniel Hale, who is a
Yes.
drone whistleblower who also leaked to the Intercept, who was a deeply good person who felt guilty, as did Reality, about his participation in the drone war, um, and is in jail right now.
Yeah. Do you mind expanding on his story a bit?
Sure, he was someone who hadn't had many opportunities growing up, who looked to the military as kind of a way to get out of his town. Very bright kid. Also, as with Reality, a linguist. And he had some very deeply unpleasant experiences as a tech in the drone war. And he carried that guilt with him. It was a, a profound burden for him. And he essentially, the only way he felt he could expunge that guilt was to reveal a lot of information about civilian deaths that he had found while working at the National Geospatial Agency. And so he many more documents than Reality he revealed to the Intercept, which then published them. And he's currently in prison.
Um, and I guess we'll just shift. Yes, obviously solidarity with Daniel Hale,
Yeah.
another incredible, grave injustice. And you tell all these stories here, and it's really under this umbrella narrative of how truth in the 21st century is as like flexible as possible, and yet there's so much information out there to aid the maximum amount of flexibility. Like the 21st century has been defined by the mass hoarding of everybody's information in this way, and yet you talk about how that helps narratives like the ones you discuss, because the government has all this information at their disposal. It's so easy to manufacture truth in that way.
Precisely. That is so well put. And I would also say it's so asymmetrical because everything is classified. And this is something you see getting out that isn't really being discussed in terms of the Trump indictment. Like, to say that something is classified is essentially to say nothing about it. There's someone in my book, Kiriakou, as you mentioned, who says, if you're at the CIA and you invite your wife to lunch, like, that's classified because everything by default is classified. And so there's all the national security state creates this like intense aura of mystique over essentially like incomprehensible amounts of information. And there's essentially no declassification going on relative to how much is being classified every day. And that puts people in a weird kind of precarity because, this is what fascist governments do. I'm not saying that our government is fascist, but
Well, we've got
they're
some fashy parts. We can say that. Yeah.
but this sense of putting everyone in a position where it's impossible not to break the law. It's very difficult not to break the law, and then selectively prosecuting different people. And people are even though it essentially means nothing to say that something's classified, people are still very taken in by the mystique of a classified document. And what's so ironic is that's what Trump got in trouble for, right? Like he was taken in by the mysterious aura of classification and wanted to show people, what he was allowed to, to have or wasn't allowed to have in boxes. So, it's just a mess. And in a strange way, it's a relatable mess because, we've all got, or at least I do, have like tons of disorganized data in places I don't really even understand where it is. But I think people don't realize how analogous that situation is to our own governments.
Right. Yeah. I'm trying to remember. Oh, we had Matthew Connolly on, right? The Declassification Engine, a book that just came out. Thank you, Bradley, for finding that so quickly. Yeah, that was just about how over the past, I don't know how many decades, we've just decided everything's classified, basically, and it's in the name of national security, and yet it has allowed for like not the deep state in the way QAnon talks about it, but really, yeah,
Yeah.
this entire apparatus that is able to act with impunity just based on like what we've decided was important as an American empire, which is to give these agencies untold power, and that includes over the mass hoarding of information.
I think that's exactly right. And I think that's why, the Espionage Act is a law that really isn't worthy of a free society. The Espionage Act reality was not given a chance during her prosecution to say, hey, I did this out of a sense of obligation. I thought people ought to know this. I was trying to inform the public about something I thought they deserved to know. She was prosecuted just as if she had done it, for fun, like Trump, or as an act of espionage, essentially, right? Like there's
Yeah.
no ability to argue for noble intent. It's just, did you have this thing that the government says is classified? And when you try to prove that it wasn't important, which like her document really wasn't particular, like no one has died or even been put in harm's way as a result of that document being released, the government will say, oh, well, you're not going to be able to build any sort of case because any documents you would like are not available to you. And to show them to you would put people in danger, right? So there's like this
Yes.
blanket argument that all of this documentation somehow is, a grave national security threat. And I'm incredibly skeptical at this point, anytime the security state makes that argument.
That is such a great point because that was the number one argument against Chelsea Manning was the fact that she revealed United States war crimes, how we were, like soldiers torturing, shooting civilians and laughing from Apache helicopters, that was in some way threatening our troops. And then, to Edward Snowden, like for Reality Winner, she was revealing what had already been talked about, that the Russian government was like trying to tilt the scales slightly for Donald Trump. It was just confirmation, and it had nothing to do with any intelligence operatives. Like the idea that you can make that argument with a straight face is laughable, and yet they do.
They do, and it was the extent to which her defense was hampered by insane logistical details having to do with classification. Like the government has all of this infrastructure to hold secret conversations, classified, protected conversations. But, if you just go out and hire a lawyer, they don't. So they had to figure out having classified phone lines. Every time all of her lawyers met, they had to meet in a skiff. Anytime they went on a document, they were told either they couldn't have it for national security reasons or that, it would be too dangerous to show them, essentially. Right. And so it was basically impossible. It was impossible for her defense team to put that document in context because they just weren't given access to any other documents. They weren't even allowed to read the document that they couldn't like Google on their computers the document that she'd already leaked that you and I could. That would have been illegal for them to do.